Good morning, everyone. Hopefully, you are still wide awake and energized by John's introduction. I must say, I thoroughly enjoyed the process of writing the paper. I don't know, John, do we have those hot off the press? We do. So they are outside. Okay. So for those of you who are old fashioned, I'm one of them actually, and prefers glossy reading material that you can actually take on a plane, there are copies of the report outside as well. But welcome to the first panel of the day. We are here with people who have either been observing or thinking about or actually implementing TPA for many years to try to demystify it a bit and hopefully ask some of the questions that are on your mind. I also like the fact that I have an A team on stage right now. I've got, starting from the end, the Alternative Association, right? I've got AIA, which has two A's in it, but also is an asset owner. An asset manager, an asset advisor. Those labels alone give you 9 A's, right? So this is going to be an awesome experience, I'm sure. John, you've kind of already given us your origin story, so I'm not going to ask you for yours. But I thought one of the things that would be really helpful is for us to explain how we became, I guess, familiar or how we started on this journey on TPA. In our own words. So our relationship with TPA, the origin story, if you will. We're not superheroes, but something like that. I would call myself an observer, by the way. So my first encounter with TPA was at CPPIB. No, I did not work for CPPIB, but I had a bunch of very curious Koreans in tow who wanted to go and see what CPPIB was all about. And I think it was 2005 when we went there and learned about their history and the reference portfolio and the thinking, which they didn't call TPA at the time, but was kind of the early, I guess, setting for what came later on. And so for me, I've had the privilege of working with asset owners for many years and observing how that's changed through history. And so that's my background. That's my origin story. Not very original. I'm not an originator. I'm just an observer. But with that, Jørn, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us your origin story?
Sure. Thank you. And thank you for having me here. I really enjoyed your presentation. I couldn't have said it better myself. So my name is Bjarne Greven Larsen. Today I am the CEO and founder of Copenhagen-based Q Blue Balanced. We are a asset management company. I used to have liabilities as well, but today I'm managing assets, systematic hedge funds, as well as systematic long-only strategies. So being invited here to the conference and thinking about what to say, I realized that I actually started implementing what was not called TPA at the time in 2001 at ATP, the Danish pension plan. The trigger was not really to changing world or resilience or anything like that. It was something as down to earth as two changes in regulation. A solvency requirement standard was being introduced for pension plans, and we shifted to market regulation. And I was so fortunately at ATP, and I realized later on it's much easier to start with a small organization and a blank piece of paper. We were 5 people managing a very big pension plan, Europe's 4th largest, and we had decided to start from scratch and figure out how to run a pension plan. And it turned out we shifted from asset classes to risk classes then. We introduced a solvency requirement. We started thinking about what was the overall objective we were trying to achieve. We introduced a risk tolerance, a risk measure, a dynamic risk budget, and started to think about factor investments between 2001 and 2004. We didn't call it TPA at the time, but it turns out now when I read papers about TPA that was really what it was. When I later in my career got the chance to move to Canada working for Ontario Teachers Pension Plan as the chief investment officer there, the reason why I was hired was really that Ontario Teachers has been a very successful bottom-up investors, private equity, infrastructure, and so on, but they wanted to implement what they call the total portfolio or total fund approach. So they were inspired by what we did at ATP. So that was really what I did for 3 years working in Toronto. And exactly to your point, John, when you work with large organizations that are already successful, culture, behavior, governance becomes much more important. If you start with a blank piece of paper and a five people, it's actually much easier to implement it. But with a successful organization as Ontario Teachers trying to change the philosophy of how to run things, that was a big change. So I got some experience there, and I think we did pretty well.
Thanks for that. So, even earlier than me, obviously, 2001, but also that journey throughout ATP and Ontario Teachers until today. So, Trevor, I know that AIA doesn't publicly claim to be a total portfolio management house, and you have serious liabilities. But still, Trevor, I think it would be interesting to hear. It might not be with AIA. I actually don't know the answer to this question. I came up with the questions, but I didn't ask for the answers ahead of time. So I'm actually very curious, Trevor, because when we talk, I can tell that you have the mindset, but I do wonder what the origin of that is.
Yeah, so my origin story would blow out the time we have, right? So I'll start my story with AIA. So we've been on a journey which echoes the points both Bjorn and John have made excellently, by the way. I did think in 5-10 minutes to try and talk about TPA and introduce the topic is challenging anyway. But linking to the origin story and picking up the point, Bjorn, it's much more harder in an established culture of investment to introduce some change or something new and something as fundamental as TPA. Our journey in AIA, many of you may be aware of, was as well catalyzed, if I start, between 10 and 7 years ago by the impending change in regulation, right? Which and this point, which actually has been a bigger theme in markets, I think, throughout our careers, which is moving to market value, as you mentioned, and a more economic approach to basically calculating solvency and risk and return. So while the entire universe has basically become a little bit more precise about the basis upon which we take risk within our portfolios as asset owners, AIA was a classic investment case study. We had predominantly one asset class within the firm that had driven tremendous profits for quite a significant number of years, and that was corporate bond credit spread. Right? That was it, the be-all and end-all of an extremely successful investment team. So if we talk about hammers and nails, every solution to every problem was credit internally. And so the journey and the origin of the concepts or the need to embrace TPA was really thinking about where does the total portfolio have to go, and where it went in its journey was we first of all introduced synthetics derivatives, right, to match our risk. And that's quite a significant change for any large-scale organization as part of its modernization. On the back of the introduction of derivatives, there were balance sheet optimization tools that were available to the firm that allowed us to do things like share buybacks, which are clearly the way that the market encourages corporates to respond going forward. And so generating higher returns within our portfolio became front and center as part of our profitability requirement. And so that's what led to a major private asset program. So we now have quite a significant and sizable private asset program that's managed from Asia. But basically that was the second piece of building out our capability and our tool set, which then created this need concurrently for us to evolve our SAA, and we still use SAA, and in some jurisdictions in the region, there is a demand from the regulator to actually have an SAA. So the concept isn't one that we're going to deviate from in any short period of time, but evolve that SAA according to the models. You mentioned quite a few of the forward-thinking asset owners in the broader, if you like, return-seeking space, but in our space, in the LDI space, pension risk transfer evolution and the back book, the BPA business in the UK, were the models that have evolved liability-driven investing, which is largely clearly where the insurance company is focused. So my origination story took us to a place where we had to, in order to communicate to our entire investment staff, adopt language like TPA. So the way I most commonly describe our journey towards TPA is that we have a very clear ALM, LDI-driven piece of our portfolio. that needs to support guarantees, that needs to support solvency metrics, etc. But then there's another part of our portfolio which looks and acts and feels like an endowment or a sovereign, where there's an ambiguity of where the next best return will come from, but some model that's necessary in order for us to shape our resources. And that's how I arrive at TPA, right? And other terms that have been used in this attempt to try and describe TPA. So the next dollar that we deploy, particularly in our risk asset space, I'm the same as a TPA investor in that case, and leads on, I think, to where we'll go in terms of some of the changes.
Yeah, that's super interesting, because I think it does highlight the fact that, and this is my theory, that TPA is a coping mechanism, a governance coping mechanism for the uncertainty of the unknown. Whereas if you have a very low target and all you really need is credit, well, do you really need TPA would be my question. But I hear echoes in both of your stories, right? The echo of the story, what I'm hearing is that you're trying to overcome a challenge that cannot be met with a framework that simply thinks about everything as benchmarks and buckets, right? And you need to have other layers of return, other ways of adding that value. I'm going to now go to our first major question. I know we talked about origin stories, and sorry, John, you've already given us your origin story, so I'm not going to ask you for yours again. But I think there are two parts to how I'm going to lead the rest of today. One part is going to be about, what are the top 3 things you need to be considering if you are actually interested in trying to adopt this, because it's not going to be right for everyone. And then the second part is, well, you've actually tried it, like what bits were difficult? Right? What are some of the practical realities of actually trying to do TPA? So we're going to break it down into those two parts. But to just kick us off, I'm going to start with a lightning round, right? So and John knows that I love to do this, but I'm going to be asking, starting from John and coming down this way, what's the one word that comes to mind when I ask you the question, what is the most important aspect of TPA? John's kind of already given 2 words. I'm not sure if you've got a different word in mind, but go ahead, John. We'll come back down this way. One word.
One word.
Okay, up to 2. Yeah, I can forgive up to 2.
Well, I'll use one that I haven't used yet, which is unfair because I sat up here for 10 minutes and used a lot of words. So I'm going to say competition.
Competition, okay. Trevor?
Yes, mine's outcome.
Outcome, okay. Competition and outcome. All right, Björn?
My single word is...
you might need the mic.
Sorry. I need the mic, yeah. My single word would be objective and risk tolerance. That was one, right?
Objective and risk tolerance. Not quite one word, but that's fine. So let's unpack that now. I asked the question, what are the top 3 things that come to mind when you think about, how to implement TPA? You gave us 2 words, but give me the reason why that was your number 1, and maybe unpack that for me.
Okay, I think what I realized early on is that a lot of the practice does it work? Yeah, it does. A lot of the way you do asset management, and as I said, I come from an organization that has liabilities not like AIA, but kind of as a pension plan. And it was interesting to hear some of the things you said, John. You were actually talking to some of the large funds in the world that was mainly with like sovereign kind of funds, buffer funds without explicit liabilities. And I think it's very different when you have explicit liabilities and you figure out how to manage assets. It becomes a total funds approach instead of a total portfolio approach, really. But what we did find is that people didn't have a common language, and we didn't have a clear objective. If everybody at all the organizations I worked at, they would say they have a clear objective, and then when you ask them what it is, and can you make that operational for us so we can use it, they don't have it. And it feels like you have to go back to start before you can really start to work. And we did that at ATP, we did that at Teachers. And it turned out after many, many, many months of discussion that the objective that we were going to use at ATP was maximizing net present value of all future pensions in purchasing power terms. And that became very operational for us, where before we didn't have that. And then the next question was, of course, but how do you limit your risk-taking? What is your risk tolerance, and how do you measure risk? And with the regulatory setup that was introduced in Denmark, it was clear that if we were not at all times overfunded, or solvent, you could say, we would be unable to fulfill our long-term purpose. So therefore, not working. I'll try this one. No, so we needed to formulate how much risk we could take, and spending time also on how do you define risk, how do you measure it, and how much can you tolerate. We spent a lot of time there. We ended up with we can only have a max 5% probability of being underfunded over the next 30 years, and then translated that into an operational expected shortfall, 5 days expected shortfall, how much money can we use on the portfolio by translating the long-term risk objective. With those two things in place, we had a common language, market value, we defined risk and objectives in the same way, and suddenly the actuarians, the ALM people, the risk people, the investment people spoke the same language, and I even got responsible for all of that because we wanted to have one fund, one unit, one way of thinking about things, and so we merged all the 4 divisions I just talked about and got going. So I think unless you have a clear objective and risk tolerance, it's very difficult to get going.
Hello. We're having some mic issues. I just wanted to say that really resonated with me because as a consultant that actually is working directly with institutions that are trying to implement TPA for the first time, they often have this urge to start with the investment piece. And oftentimes I have to tell them, actually, the first thing you have to do is start with the people piece, and the part that you need to change is the common language, right? It's exactly what you said, but that common language is invariably, as you've just talked about, the risk language. In fact, one of the large funds in North America, if you go to the paper, of the 12 funds, three were from North America, and not all of them were Canadian, actually. Some of them were American. It might have been more. It might have been 5, actually, from North America, including the Canadians. But one of the funds who had been struggling with this basically said, I walk the halls, and I still hear people talking about asset classes. And that really just gets me because you're still in SAA land when people are just talking about asset classes. You know that you're in TPA land when all your organization is talking about is risk. So we have not, been successful at changing the language, and that's something we still need to change. So, I didn't mean to start with you, Björn, but I'm very glad that we ended up doing that. So, Trevor, your word?
Yeah, look, I mean, so I knew you were going to talk about language, and I think that's a necessary condition for the change that we're talking about. Always taking the other side as well. The problem with language is as we evolve it, people want to hook onto that and lock that in, and then not change again. And there's a flexibility in language, and that's really why my word was outcome, because we've chosen language actually to describe even the change that we've been going through. I'd say the first 5 years were significant changes in terms of turning from a single asset class into a multi-asset, liquid and illiquid, derivatives enabled, sophisticated multi-asset portfolio, right? So, I mean, that's a mouthful, and even more complex to manage and put in place governance around. The other point I'll pick up before I get to outcome is that asset owners have nowhere to kick the risk, right? So you mentioned board a number of times because the most senior governance committee within an organization is actually where all the risk sits, right? As an asset manager, and that's really where I wanted to go to with this outcome point, you've got a mandate. Someone's given you the money. They've parameterized the objectives for you, right, in the context that we're all familiar with, right, and in language which is asset class specific or product specific. And many asset managers are still product oriented, which is where I'm glad you got that point in, John, at the end about how asset managers have to change their language to interact with the language that we're developing as asset owners. So outcome is the word for me because there is different roles played by different portions of our portfolio, and we have different products that give rise to different allocation strategies, etc. And so understanding the outcome from your asset class, from your chosen area of specialism in the asset management space, from where you think you found alpha, but linking that to the outcome of the asset owner has been the piece that I think is really difficult to land with everyone. There will always be specialists, right? There'll be graduation of knowledge and understanding within an investment program of what different people do, right? And it really is a top-down thought around TPA. But then, you know, and on a modular level, you're delegating TPA down to different sub-buckets and different portions of the portfolio. And the big theme for us in insurance globally is about using our risk budget better, right? So taking a modular and invariably, therefore, suboptimal approach to your asset allocation leaves money on the table, leaves risk on the table that through substitution, cross-asset class, and at a total portfolio level, you could actually get better outcomes, right? And more risk-efficient outcomes or more return-efficient outcomes, right, for the same risk. And so that's why bringing this point to where we've applied TPA and where we're moving into TPA is in our private asset portfolio. So not in our fixed income portfolio, as you mentioned. Their relative value has a role, right? But it's got a different role in terms of our asset allocation and strategy. But in our private asset program, the bulk of our private asset program, whether it's PE, whether it's indirect real estate, whether it's private credit, whether it's venture capital, all has the same bogey, right? Which is basically it's funded from equities and it has to outperform equities. So whether I've given an allocation to private credit within that pot of money, or whether it's to indirect real estate, actually what I'm most interested in is how quickly will the money be deployed? How certain am I that I will achieve my bogey, which is equities plus a premium? And then how much do I participate in the upside that I might be able to potentially get? So thinking about outcomes outside of asset classes, but in terms of what we want from those assets, regardless of asset classes, has been our path to TPA.
There are a couple of things that Trevor just mentioned in that I think I'd just like to highlight. One of them is balance sheet. Almost all of the adopters of TPA, and it's a spectrum, but those that have moved towards the far end of the spectrum are using their balance sheet mentality. You know, they're thinking about the fund as a single balance sheet and then looking for ways to basically capitalize on that. I'd say that's a higher standard of TPA relative to those that are early adopters. A couple of other points is Trevor just took you through a few layers of how he's thinking about layering on returns, and he also talked about his bogey. But I think what we find when we're talking to people who are now trying to adopt TPA, a lot of them are actually starting off with an endowment mindset, right? Not necessarily because they're not pension funds, but like the Middle East, for example, is a good situation. We copy best practice based on what we think is best practice at the time. Many sovereigns thought of endowment model as the best practice. But that endowment model is also very much an SAA mindset. It simply replaces certain asset classes for alternatives. But what Trevor was describing was the recognition that there are layers of return, layers of ways to get to whatever number it is. If your number is 5%, you're not really going to need these additional tools. But if your number is 10%, it's pretty clear that a static SA approach, a reference portfolio, then a static SA approach is not going to get you there. And you're leaving money on the table, exactly what you said, Trevor. And so it is, how do you unlock other sources of return to be able to add on to that to get your target, whatever it is. If it's 10%, then 10%. John, it's been a while before we've gotten you to speak, but can you unpack your one word?
Yes, competition. So that was shorthand for competition for capital. And you know what I've often said, as you heard me say, that the kind of foundational elements that determine success of TPA start with governance and culture, the people element. That said, when people ask me what defines or what is the identity of TPA, how will I know, what does it look like that's so different? So the ethos of TPA, I think, is in its competition for capital. Now, to be a bit provocative, SAA is not competitive at the portfolio level. And I'm going to be overly crude and probably unfair to most of us. But usually what happens is you've got a policy portfolio, your asset allocation, that's usually run by the board, or perhaps there's a committee that includes the CIO. And then that's assigned to the asset class heads or the teams. And so there's bucket limits or bucket ranges, and those heads go fill up the buckets. And then it's all mashed together, and we kind of pretend that's a proxy for diversification. This is how, again, we were brought up. That is the water we've swum in for our entire careers. Unless you manufacture or contrive competition at the portfolio level, you're only optimizing for the asset classes. So you're never optimizing at the fund level. And so competition for capital at the total portfolio, total fund level, suggests that every marginal dollar has to earn its place. It doesn't matter what labels or buckets it originates in. It doesn't matter if a bucket's already full, because you're at least downplaying, if not eliminating, a policy portfolio and asset allocation completely. And you're simply optimizing around what is going to get you the objective that your client or your beneficiary needs. Now, of course, all of this is constrained by a risk budget, which is usually expressed in a reference portfolio, and certainly your needs for paying liabilities, which is expressed in ALM and things like liquidity budget. But with those two constraints, outside of that, it really is about, for every additional investment, is this the very best use of this next dollar, regardless of labels or buckets?
So we have now spent about half of our time focusing on, what are the elements of success based on our own experience. But now I'd like us to go back to storytelling. So practical war stories from the field. I don't want you to give me the happy story. Give me like a horror story or something. Give me something that's interesting. I'm going to start with you, Bjorn. You've had the most experience working for different asset owners, and I'm sure you've got some really hairy stories in there somewhere. So, tell us how it can all go wrong, or maybe tell us how you were able to turn around a story, but the practical realities of actually trying to implement this and getting people to play ball.
Sure. Let me try and see if I can live up to that expectation. I think one thing that I realized probably around 2005 or so was that how much harm the benchmark focus has done to organizations, and really I really even got a clearer look into that at Ontario Teachers. So in some way, I think you have to cut the chains of benchmark tyranny, and if you do that and instead allocating capital, as John said, based on risk budgets and how much return can you get for every risk dollar, start thinking about risk. What surprised me on the positive side was that you unleash innovation and creativity, and people really start to think about, if you're running a credit book, if you had a benchmark that was 25% high yield, 50% investment grade, 25% emerging market, then you could have small deviations from that. But if you instead give the credit team a risk budget and tell them how much risk they can take, and you don't really care about how they split them between different risk or different classes, asset classes within the risk budget, you suddenly find that teams start to not have any investment grade at all, have it all in a barbell strategy and so on. So it unleashes innovation if you do that. So that's the good part. What is the bad thing about benchmarks? What I realized was the boards, they don't feel really, they didn't do so at ATP, they didn't do so at Teachers, they don't feel they owe the benchmarks. It's something the CEO, the CIO has recommended to them, and typically they just, well, that sounds about right. Maybe you ask the consultants, but there's no real owners of the benchmark, and you have really moral hazard problems in most organizations, because if you have compensation that is linked to beating the benchmark, hunting for alpha, doing excess returns, then there is a tendency in organizations to try and recommend to the board benchmarks that are easy to beat. So you have that kind of moral hazard. I think that was pretty telling when there is a big international organization that compares returns in big pension plans. So when I did my due diligence moving to Canada, it turned out that Ontario Teachers and ATP, they both had the same return over 20 years. Very good returns compared to a lot of other institutions. But ATP, that was at that time much more TPA, top-down focused, had benchmarks that had returned 2% better return than Ontario Teachers benchmarks, whereas Ontario Teachers has created 2% more alpha because it was a bottom-up, go and hunt, find alpha. So I think people should really be careful thinking about, is there any owners of benchmark and how much harm they do by limiting innovation and creativity in organizations?
And if you're as big as they are, OTPP or CPPIB, I mean, you have hundreds, possibly even thousands of people as your alpha hunters, right? And so you can't simply, I'm just going to change my model overnight.
No, I think that's true. And one thing there, I think it has become part of TPA to say you have to tear down silos. I think that's wrong. Shouldn't tear down silos. You should connect them. and maybe you should build a top floor level where people can meet, and maybe you have people that only works at the top level. But I think if you have an organization like Teachers with really successful bottom-up teams, make sure you don't ruin that, you don't create chaos. Keep the silos that work, but connect them and create some kind of an overlayer to that.
Yeah, I think that is absolutely true. We actually, when we are talking to funds that have been so-called successful at TPA, two of the big issues that come up, number one, is that the reference portfolio turns into a benchmark, if you have them. Just in case people are wondering, only about 50% of the funds who have adopted TPA use a reference portfolio. Not everybody uses a reference portfolio. But for the ones that have replaced SAA with a reference portfolio, what they find is then the board gravitates to that becoming the new performance benchmark, which basically defeats the whole purpose. And so that's one of the issues. The other issues is exactly what Bjørn just said. If you do not take care to manage the alpha teams well, you will end up disenfranchising them by moving to TPA. And so keeping that balance is very tricky. John, I'm going to move over to you because, let's face it, the US has been a laggard in terms of making any such adoptions. I like to joke that it's because it came from Canada and Australia, but I'm sure there are other reasons that maybe you can tell us. What is it that you're seeing in the US? Why has it been so hard for the US funds from your perspective?
I think it's a number of things. And by the way, a real case study is Stephen Gilmore moving from Kiwi Super over to CalPERS. And so this will be an interesting test to your exact question, because he is all in. And I assure you, made clear to the board during the interview process that he expects them to be all in. And there is a bit of a decision tree that's very tangible decision tree coming, as I understand it, in a few weeks. So we're going to see in live technicolor how a U.S. pension and all of its typical dysfunctional governance could possibly move this route. I think the major problems that Stephen and everybody are going to face is that, look, if I'm completely honest, typically a state pension or municipal pension is bound and disrupted by massive politicization of the appointees. So in some cases, the governors literally appoint some of the board members. In other cases, they are representatives of the underlying beneficiaries, so teachers, for example. Now, those create problems, two different problems. One is that you're biased by perhaps getting reelected or perhaps a hobby horse or an agenda, and so you're not there to release or empower the CIO because you want to grandstand and have kind of control of the levers. The idea of asking these political appointees to let go of asset allocation, of risk budget, and give the CIO and his or her office a lot more power is just, I think, contradictory to kind of how they think. And then the representatives, look, I think anybody that runs these large teacher funds, CalSTRS being the largest in the US, loves the fact that there are actual teachers that are representing their constituents, but these are not investment professionals and they don't pretend to be. And so you've got this combination of poorly composed, for different reasons, poorly composed, under-optimized boards that for various reasons are disinclined to be giving more empowerment. And as a result of that, you feel stuck and constrained. And often what US pension CIOs will say, because they are the poster children for strict SAA, is that I don't even want to bother going back to the board to increase my venture capital piece. I've got 2 new potential GPs I want to invest in now. And if you're a TPA, you don't need to go back because again, there's no bucket that you exceed or that you're under. You simply add what's best. But in the case of an SAA that's run by a board, you got to go back, and often there's 2 meetings or 3 meeting process where they have to discuss, consider, approve, and often the CIOs will tell me in private, why even bother? It's just too much trouble. By the time I get to approval, this alpha opportunity or the window will have closed. And so I think there's just multiple disincentives in the way they're structured around governance and culture that make it very challenging for the typical US pension.
And certainly consultants and their benchmarks have not helped, right? So I should own some of that as well, right?
You have not helped. You've been created to perpetuate SAA in many ways, at least originally.
I think your point is excellent, John, in the sense that sometimes people forget how path dependent most systems are. And so just let me tell you a short story about Canada and Ontario Teachers. Ontario Teachers is one of the first and oldest pension plans there. Dates back to, way back. When it was formed with a proper board, the former governor of the central bank in Canada, Bowie, he said, he was asked if he would take the role as chairman, and he said, yes, sure, I will. 2 conditions. 1, professional board, no representatives from the government or the teachers, or at least just a few. And secondly, I want to be able to compete with the rest of the industry. So I want to be able to hire people that can compete with the other financial industry. And I think that in some way was the starting point for the governance model in a lot of Canadian pension plans, because a lot of the others more or less followed that model. And that's not the case in the US. So I think things are much more path dependent than you would think they were.
Well, let's see how many U.S. pension plans start hiring Canadians. That might tell you something, because I can tell you they're hiring a lot of them in the Middle East. I'm going to move over to you, Trevor. This might be the end of our panel, because we are running out of time. You have, seen or witnessed the transformation at AIA. You saw, or helped to create this centralized asset management function here in Singapore. I'm sure, absolutely sure, that disruption and that change comes with lots of war stories. So, whilst you have already told us what you guys have done to create almost this quasi-sovereign within an insurance company, one that can implement some elements of TPA. I mean, what did you find the most challenging, or what are your practical realities?
Yes, and let's bank at the same time benchmarks and incentives and frictional governance. I mean, yeah, again, all of those things in droves. But the story I'll tell, and sorry, it won't be as exciting as you portray it, actually, Jane, is really this evolution of private asset investing for us, right? And how it's so easy, taking the point about benchmarking and incentives, it's so easy, and actually the entire system is oriented towards locking in on something, set and repeat. That's the asset management industry, and that's why it's product focused, right? The reason why I'm now responsible for strategic partnerships is we're talking to our partners or our managers and saying, we want you to move from product to TPA, right? Where you've got the multi-asset capability, etc. And so, so the private asset story, which I think will resonate particularly in this part of the world, but given its explosion anyway across the whole of capital markets and the importance of private assets alongside public assets, our starting point is a well-documented evolution, right? So we started, and we've been deploying significant amounts of money over the last 3 or 4 years into private assets. We started with funds, right? And that creates this particular type of interaction, actually, that Asia is pretty well set up for, right? Favor trading, stack them high in a fund, and basically get people into that fund. And then you're at the mercy of deployment rates, drawdown rates, like LPACs to influence, and that's the way to access private assets if you're starting out, right? And then, of course, you want to access secondaries, you want to access co-investments. Like, do you start building your own function to do the underwriting, or do you rely more on managers? And that's, if you like, part 2. And then you move fully into customized solutions, right? Which is basically communicating the TPA objectives directly to your partners, and that's where we're going. And that has been, even in a very short period of time, very difficult to navigate, because everyone, as I said, wants to come in, they want to understand their objectives, they want to understand how they're getting paid. And in the context of private assets particularly, it's a long-term investment. And like, how do you argue where your value is? How do you argue about how you should be measured and paid? Right? A lot of the core primary providers don't have that argument because they participate in carry. But to what extent do you participate in that process as an asset owner? And your own competition for talent point in terms of how you need to keep that oversight at a certain level. That's been the challenge that we continuously have to create the rigor around the language and the objectives. And so taking it all the way back to benchmarking, Our target for TPA is an absolute return. It's a number. And we started with our private asset program with that, right? So through rain or sunshine, basically, we want a set number. And so that's actually really difficult, right? None of our academic literature, none of where we've taken the whole investment philosophy and the tools that we put in place, do we know how to target a number. And the biggest argument that we have internally is what's the right number. Actually, it doesn't really matter what the number is.
There is no right
number. It's always
number.
going to be wrong, right? But the idea of targeting absolute return is the biggest challenge that we've got.
Yeah. And so with that, we are going to close the panel. I am going to leave you with one final thought, which is that earlier I said start with people. Trevor's just talked to you about incentives. We are currently working with a fund that is implementing TPA. And only 1 month in, they've already introduced us to their HR person because they've come to realize that without changing the incentives, this is not going to work. And so the final anecdote I'll leave you with is CPPIB has recently created a new function. So instead of just having total fund management, they now have one fund management as well. And it's 2 separate teams. So it's like, hang on, what is this one fund management? What I came to realize was that the total portfolio management team reports into the CIO. But the one fund management team, it's a smaller team, actually reports into the CEO. And the reason for that is because the CIO does not have the power to change incentives. Right? The CIO has the power to touch on the investment teams, but they don't really have the power to change incentives. And so they need that function, the one fund management function, to be able to enable that. So I'll leave you with that one thought. Even CPPIB, which is considered to be the father in some ways of TPA, is constantly making changes to align. And I find that really interesting. With that, thank you. Please give a round of applause to our panel. I hope it was an enlightening discussion.